Hey, welcome to the Cost of the Status Quo. My name's Lindsay Lerner, and for years I've worked as a tour manager, founder of a co-working and production space for musicians, and travel business development and partnerships expert. I'm fascinated by digging into why people do what they do and how they're able to navigate challenges in unique ways. What I've observed over the last decade through my work and travel is that we often react to systems and constraints, not necessarily our truest selves. We then end up in places in our lives where we feel disconnected, dissatisfied, and ultimately confused. This is the cost of the status quo. Today, we're here with the one and only Sandra Enos of Giving Beyond the Box, a company that curates gift boxes that feature products that carry social missions, like refugee resettlement, concern for the environment, empowering women, providing clean water, and much more. If that wasn't enough, Sandra is also a sociology professor at large, and Sandra and I met when I was a student at Bryant University. Unfortunately, I never had her as a professor, but she was a great mentor and now friend. Thank you so much for being here.
I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be here with you, especially.
Absolutely. Are we calling in from down by the beach today?
Well, it's 7 minutes from the beach. I'm here in lovely, historic Peacedale, so it's just a beautiful day in Rhode Island.
Let's take a moment, take a step back, and share a little bit of your backstory. So could you tell me about where your parents are from and how the heck you got to good old Rhode Island?
So I'm a native Rhode Islander. My mom and dad were first-generation immigrants. My dad from a little island in the Azores called San Miguel, and my mother from just outside Quebec. She was French-Canadian. They're very working class, work with their hands, worked in factories. And I grew up in that kind of, household with my parents, especially my dad, had fought in the World War, and he was a great believer in the American dream. Although he didn't ask a lot of America except to work really hard and be devoted to his family and save enough money to have a house. So he died before we really got to talk about my future. He died when I was 14. But I always felt he thought that I could do just about anything. But what was most important was that I'd be a nice person. He didn't care really that much that I was smart. Neither did my mother. Neither of them were impressed at all. You leave that kind of household with a very kind of humble idea of yourself. So when you really get out to the real world and they kick you in the teeth because you are, in fact, not the most special person on the planet, you're not surprised at all.
You were ready.
Exactly. Somebody asked me recently, did you ever imagine that you'd become a college professor? I said, no, and neither did anybody in my family. I still think some of them thought I must have won the degree in a card game.
That's how it works, right?
That's how it works. Exactly. So, I was lucky to go to Rhode Island College. It was completely tuition free when I went. I was basically, my tuition was subsidized by the taxpayers in Rhode Island, with this different philosophy at that time that we want to educate working class kids to take their place in the economy. We think that's a really good investment. So I, by the benefit of the generosity of Rhode Islanders, I got a BA, and then somebody there thought I was smart enough to get a master's degree. And then I took 25 years off before I got a PhD.
Wow. And when you were at Rhode Island College, were you studying sociology?
Yeah, I took my first sociology class in my freshman year, my junior year. And from then on, I knew finally I could study something where I could have ideas of my own. I could become an independent critical thinker. I moved from being sort of like a monkey mind. Those of us who are good students can memorize and can impress our teachers with what we can repeat. But sociology, there was an opportunity to really think about things that were really happening, things that I knew were true about my life. And so I just loved it. And that's the only degrees I have, sociology, and sociology. Thank God there wasn't another degree. That would have been really something.
I love it. And so when you graduated from Rhode Island College, what were those options for you? Or was there rather a path that was pretty straightforward for you at that time?
Because I went to school in the 60s, in the early 70s, it was civil rights, ending Vietnam, and giving back was the generational challenge created by John Kennedy. So one of the reasons that I kept in school was because I wanted to join the Peace Corps. I wanted to be part of that young idealist generation. And then I was so concerned about American foreign policy that I decided to join VISTA instead. So I left Rhode Island College and worked as a VISTA volunteer in Alabama for a year in the early days of the 1970s. And I was assigned to become a community organizer in a very rural, mainly Black community in the South. If you're 21 years old and your job is to end poverty, but you don't have any money.
That's a heavy lift.
It was a really heavy lift. And, when I think about that whole program, the idea that we're going to send in young, idealistic people into communities they know nothing about.
That's what I was going to say. Is there any background for listeners who don't know anything about the AmeriCorps program or the VISTA program in general?
Yeah, so the idea was that this was sponsored by the federal government, and it continues to be, so that people can go into communities that need and do what they can. Now, when I was there, you could just go and do anything you wanted. You could rile up populations and revolt against the bourgeoisie, but that was ended, and they finally decided that we would all work with nonprofit organizations. We're working with Head Start as our sort of cover. But we had people, in our group that were working to get women access to birth control and to work on food issues. And I worked on housing issues. I built houses when I was there in a federal program. But, Lindsay, I think what was so interesting, and I think probably some of your comments have already pointed to that, you look back sometimes when you're my age, I'm in my 70s, and you look back to being like 21 and you're thinking, right, so here I was, this little Yankee, and I've got a degree in sociology, and I'm going to somehow think that I have something important to offer, to other people. And, people would ask us questions like all the time, like the chief of police in the little town would say, you came all the way here. Don't you have any problems at home you might want to attend to? Or people would say, aren't you pretty enough to get married? Like, what are you doing here? It was just so hard for us to make ourselves like understood, we're here to help you. And other people would say, are our problems like that bad, that you had to come? Why do you think our problems are any worse than anybody else's? So on one hand, you think, I'm going to go and change the world. I know I'm going to be accepted by people who see me. I'm such a lovable kid. I'm devoting a year of my life, and people greet you and they say, we're good. And what's the matter with you?
That's been a common thing on this podcast so far, has been the audacity that we have when we're younger. And now that we're talking about it, I guess it's a bit more ignorance then.
Yeah, it's audacity, it's ignorance, and it's just sort of, being open to those sort of experiences. Most of my friends didn't go to VISTA. Nobody I talked to when I was 21 thought it was a good idea for me to go to VISTA. Everybody's like, I don't know if you're familiar with the movie Easy Rider, but it's about some hippies who are on a motorcycle. Everybody thought for sure that I was going to be shot in the head. Like everybody, all the time, And it was just because it was such a strange environment for us too, Yankees being in the middle of the South. People would come over, like the white folks would come over and like leave a shotgun for us, to protect ourselves, which was a good idea because we had no phone. There was no police like anywhere around, I mean, there was like just nothing where we were. We were like, and we was like, oh no, we don't want a gun. We don't want a gun. We're good. We're going to bake some cookies and go down to the community center and see if we can, empathize.
That's wild. And so you're in Alabama, you're attempting to do this work, you're physically literally building homes. And do you know what the other students that were in your graduating class were doing?
Yeah, they were becoming school teachers and social workers and nurses and getting married and, doing all those traditional things, none of which had like even an ounce of interest to me. Like nothing like that seemed. So it was sort of like, like that book, Hope in the Unseen. I knew that there was something other, and I knew I wanted to make a contribution. And I knew I was sort of, analytical as well, even through all this experience, which is, some days were absolutely frightening in terms of our physical safety. Some days we were like really in danger. But like of all of that, I think I spent most of my life trying to figure out like, what are the holes in our system? And is that the hole I should poke myself into? What's going to work? It was an amazing year because I also got to see the great cultural superiority of those of us in the Northeast, who are in constant rage against everybody else because they don't think like we do, and I say that given all the politicization and stuff, but oh my God, that was just fascinating.
And so after a year, you've got all this experience and this new perspective under your belt. How did you decide what was next?
Well, when I was at Rick, somebody mentioned to me like about graduate school, and they said that they thought I should go to graduate school. Now, I had no idea even what that was, like no joke. I had no idea how professors got to be professors. So I applied to a number of graduate schools, and Brown let me in for a 4-year scholarship, like through my PhD, you know. And as much of a cultural clash it was going from, you know, my own background to going to Alabama, going from my own background to going to Brown was also such a cultural shock. I had no idea about the hierarchy of universities. I had no idea what it meant to go to a selective school. I had no idea that those students were going to be so different than the students like I knew at Rhode Island College. There were 12 of us, and we were welcome to the graduate students' sherry hour at Brown at Maxey Hall in the sociology department there. And I'm just asking everybody, so where did you go to school? Everybody's like Princeton, blah, 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 Yale, Pennsylvania. I just came back from a Fulbright, blah, 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 blah. What does your father do? Oh, he's a professor too. He's at Columbia. What does your father do? And I was able to say, my God, thanks, he's dead,
That's wow.
But before he died, he installed bottled gas. He was a factory guy. He was a mechanic, and people would say in the most patronizing way, oh, how fascinating. I mean, it was just, and nobody was being mean. It was just my under socialization in terms of being in an atmosphere like that. And then at the end of the sherry hour, the chair took me aside and said to me, my gosh, how far you've come. We read your essay, and you come from this immigrant family, and the Portuguese really know how to build a wall. Oh my gosh, they can really build a wall, and they save so hard, and they're such hardworking, sincere people. And what's that bread you can buy at the bakery? So I told them everything. And they're like, and so I was the first Portuguese student. I was the first student from Rhode Island College to get into graduate school, in that program. So it was like first, and the chair was reminding me, you're the first of yours. He said, however, just in case, we've arranged extra help for you. So at any time, if you feel like you're struggling, just come to see me. We've got a tutor. We've got a couple of tutors. They're more than happy to help you. And I didn't talk to anybody about any of this because I knew my parents wouldn't understand. My relatives didn't understand. My uncle, Gene, thought that graduate school was somewhere you went if you failed out of classes, like it was summer school. When I told him I was going to Brown, he's like, why would you go to Brown? They don't even have a football team. I mean, not to speak of, so there's just nobody to talk to about this. But as a young person, 22 years old, I was trying to think, well, if I get help, that sort of means that I need help and maybe that I shouldn't be here. So the only way to succeed was to work like as hard as I could, at least through the master's. I took all the classes, finished up my degree and all my requirements in about 12 months. I had a master's degree, which was supposed to take me 2 years, because I just couldn't stand the culture. I just couldn't feel like, how hard do I have to work? Am I a fraud? This is not an environment I'm going to excel in. I don't want to spend so much time talking with professors about, how many data elements I need to have and, trying to study things they were interested in. I just wanted to get out into the real world and do something. And, I would try to talk to them, I've just been to Vista, and I've been fighting poverty. They're like, we don't care about that.
Wow, that's eye-opening for sure, huh? And so you race through your master's degree, and then what? Avoid all social interactions with any professors, crank it out, and then what happens post that?
So I took a federal civil service entrance exam because I thought, I could work for the feds. So I got a 99 on that test. So, which meant that if you then enter the management training department of federal civil service, I could either go to West Virginia and work for Social Security or go to Chicago and work for the Bureau of Public Debt.
Those are enticing options.
You don't know the half of it. And it was fascinating sociologically because they were trying to replace like people who had started like at the bottom of the civil service and like worked their way up to be managers with like college graduates. So there was like all this like resentment of like college graduates who were just going to pop into management. And these organizations, Lindsay, were completely like rule bound.
That wasn't quite what you were going for then?
I mean, my God. But you know those times when you do something and you just say, I can't imagine how anything could be like less right for me, you know? I mean, it was just, and it was Chicago, it was the middle of winter. I was all alone, you know, once again in that arrogance of youth. I can go to Chicago, I'll make friends. I've always made friends my whole life. How bad can it be? And I was staying in this like little hovel with cockroaches, and it was probably one of the hardest, years of my life. And then after that, I came back, picked up my degree at Brown University, and then I started applying for jobs, and I've been fruitfully employed ever since.
You come back to Rhode Island after your terrible experience in Chicago, and then...
Yep, so I began working for nonprofits. I began to work for nonprofits, like doing program evaluation for criminal justice programs. And then from there, I worked at the state prison for a while when the state was under federal court order. Just an amazing scene. And then from there, I went to child welfare for about 6 years. Then I went and I was doing computer things because somebody asked me to. I didn't have any training. And then from there, I worked in high tech for a couple of years, working for a small data management company, going all over the United States and selling training packages to them. What happened to me then? I think I went back to corrections, did some more data management. Then when I was there, after that, I went to the State House. I worked for as a policy aide for the governor of the state for less than a year. Then I worked at URI. And during all of this time, I would be teaching classes at Rhode Island College as an adjunct professor. In sociology, I would be teaching criminal justice and sociology of the family.
Was there any difference between what you were teaching in the classroom and then obviously your personal life and your career was much different? What was that experience like, or that discrepancy rather?
Yeah. I loved, to me, like being able to like go and teach, for like 6 hours. I would go 4 to 7 and then 7 to 10 was absolutely like creative and engaging. And and because once again, I was teaching sociology of the family, I was working at child welfare. So you got to bring, a very different perspective from the students. And I was teaching criminal justice. I was working at the state prison. So I was able in those classes to, ask students about public policy questions, Today at the Department of Corrections, we got to think about this policy. Should we treat men and women alike in prison? Should women have access to the same programs that men do? And the students would say yes. And I said, well, do they have access to the same punishments? Like, do we want to shackle them when they go to the hospital and have a baby the way we shackle men when they go to the hospital? It's like, So it helped me understand, how engaging a classroom could be. To have these jobs, which are sort of interesting, but then to have the great creativity of being able to teach young people and being very interested in what they had to say, that was just a gift. I really enjoyed that.
Absolutely. And then, so you find yourself, 50 and decide you go back to school?
Yes, pretty close. And I had run into, everything's an accident. I had run into the chair of the department in a grocery store. And she said to me, hey, Sandra, we probably never told you this after teaching as an adjunct for 12 years, but your course evaluations are like the best in the department. You've got you're really good at this, And because I didn't know, they just kept hiring me and nobody ever came to watch me teach, ever. I never had a classroom evaluation, ever. So I said, well, yeah, okay, so I'm a good teacher. What do you make of that? She said, you should go back and get your PhD. And I flashed back to like being at Brown and thinking, oh my God, academic BS, I could never do it. So I sat on that for about 2 years, and then I went to UConn and I took a class because it would be a different university, state university, younger faculty. They were known, researchers on HIV, which I worked on, and a number of other issues, prisons, incarceration. So I went and I took a class, and it was a qualitative methodology class, which is a sociology, anthropologist too, that it's all about trying to see how other people are understanding the world. So I did qualitative sociology, and I looked at the parenting program at the women's prison to see how women there defined what it meant to be a mother while you're incarcerated. And that was fascinating. I got an A in the class. I just loved it. It was about as intellectually on fire as I had been in years. And then I applied for admission to the school, and that eventually became my doctoral thesis.
What do you think the ultimate difference was between the status quo that existed in academia when you were at Brown versus at UConn, other than obviously the institution is different?
So it's the institution, it's the culture. It's like 20 years like later when I was at Brown, there was no ethnic studies, there was no women's studies, there was none of this. People are important to listen to, so there's like none of that. They were very good at like older adults pursuing education. They were not so focused at like our students have to be scholars. We want to get them into Chicago. We want to get them into the best programs. There was really not that much emphasis. The real emphasis was let's ask some interesting questions, questions that matter, So I was, I was all about that.
Definitely. And then, so you get to be a professor post that.
Yep, they let me be a professor. Yep. I was lucky enough to get a job at Rhode Island College. I was there for 8 years. And then I went to Bryant for my last 13 years. Yeah, it's kind of a mess of a career, but that's what happened. You take a wrong path, you just learn a little bit more about yourself, that as much as they say, what sometimes you'll have to do anything just to put food on the table, which I've done. I've worked in factories. That was all my summer work, factories of waitressing. But even in those jobs, there was a certain like dignity to them, and a certain respect for people who had been doing this like all their lives. It's a long way down the open road, but I've got my shoes tied on tight.
So not to breeze over your time as a professor, but in the last couple of minutes we have here, I would really love to hear more about what you've done since.
I had run little pop-up marketplaces at Bryant during the holidays, and I would always invite social entrepreneurs, like, Providence Granola, Beautiful Day, River's Edge, and I would see how well those went. I would see how happy consumers were, like faculty, students, and staff, to buy a good that gave back to the community. And we did one year where we did really, really well. And I was trying to figure out, like, well, how do I replicate this magic? I don't want to run pop-up markets for the rest of my life. But can I put together products and boxes so that people feel wonderful about giving the gift? I want to give this gift to you, Lindsay, because I know you care about the empowerment of women and you care about welcoming immigrants into our community. I want to give you this gift. And so for me, I, as the gift giver, get to give you that. I feel great. You receiving the gift, think, wow, she really knows me. She knows what I care about. She wants to celebrate it. And then there's the benefit of, all the giving back that it does to communities, whether it's a social enterprise or a BIPOC-owned business, a woman-owned business, local farmers, Rhode Island artists. So the idea there is to sort of build boxes that serve a lot of audiences, but also to build bridges, so that people in the white community understand that there's a way to connect to the BIPOC community through these boxes to support these small businesses, to build a community that way. So so that's been fun. And to me, it's not it's not retired. It's like repurposing, it's like retreading, I get to surround myself with people who are working really hard to make this the kind of community we want to live in, whether it's small businesses or people who are working on refugees or homelessness or women's issues. I mean, no matter how hard we could work, we could never do everything. So the important part is to support each other, every way we can. If we want to live in a decent community, that sort of village that raises children and raises each other up, we don't have any other options but to rely on each other.
Are there any trends that you've observed since being in the business world, whether it's small business, entrepreneurship, startups, however you want to view it? Any trends that you've observed that you'd like to see changed in that capacity?
Well, certainly, Amazon, I think, should just be ashamed of themselves. I'm worried about the loss of businesses to places like Amazon, the loss of community. I'm worried about that. I'm worried about, not to get too political, but a Supreme Court that is increasingly, divergent from what Americans, what the country really wants to see. I'm worried about that. On the other hand, I'm increasingly excited about, movements like Local Road Turn Rhode Island, which is trying to build up the local economy, and people like yourselves as well, thinking about, what is all this about? How do we get each other on, on a path here so that we're walking towards some good end?
Exactly. So would you say, are there any specific skills that you've learned, whether it's now on this more entrepreneurial track or perhaps from being a sociologist for so long? Are there any tips, tricks, habits that you use daily or in, a course of a year or a course of your whole life that have really made a difference in that you've learned along the way?
I think something I learned along the way, and maybe this was after I left being a sociology professor, because it's such an isolating kind of world, self-referential. I mean, before I launched this little business, I talked to 72 different people about whether or not it was a good idea, and continued to improve the idea, because increasingly you just realize that you just don't know. You're at home in some communities, but not at home in others. So just asking people, and you do this wonderfully well, informational interviewing, just to find out what's on people's mind, how your own ideas can be improved. I think that listening, that humility, that visionary thinking is just important. And we can't do any of that alone. It's just not a game of solitaire. It's just, we just need to connect in as many ways as we can.
On that note specifically, we do ask every guest these two questions. I think it ties in nicely here. What is the worst piece of advice that you've ever gotten? And on the flip side of that, what is the best piece of advice that you've ever gotten?
Right. Both are challenging questions. I think the worst piece of advice was a friend of mine, when I was telling her that I was thinking about going to graduate school, reminded me that there were already 10,000 unemployed sociologists in the world, didn't need another one. And if I wanted to get a degree, I should get an MBA. And she was a sociologist. She was a fully tenured professor. So, I ignored that advice. And probably the best advice was that story I told you earlier about, there's something about you that makes you a good teacher. Maybe you should explore it. And that was more of a suggestion than her saying you really should go and get a PhD as soon as you can. So those two things were, really launched me on a path that I would have never, ever, ever taken up, ever, which is, the power of making suggestions to each other when you say, you are so articulate, you need to write a book, or, oh my God, you should take that idea and really build it out, whatever it is, because you never know how important that is to someone.
Without a doubt. Wow. Thank you. Thank you for sharing all of that.
Absolutely. I hope it made some sense. I didn't have an outline or slides or no footnotes, so I apologize to my sociology colleagues. Nothing I said was properly cited. I apologize.
We can add it in the show notes. We'll have proper citations. Don't you worry about a thing.
That's great.
Thank you again for being here.
Absolutely.